I was having coffee with an old friend in Munich last month, a man who prides himself on his clinical rationality and his collection of impeccably restored mid-century watches. We were discussing the recent shifts in German politics, and I casually mentioned that some international economists were suggesting Germany finally loosen its debt brake to stimulate the economy. Usually he is the picture of composure, but at that moment, his grip tightened on his espresso cup until his knuckles went white. He didn't cite interest rates or GDP growth. Instead, he looked at me with a sudden, haunted intensity and said, "If we break the balance, the walls come down. Everything we've built since the ruins, it just dissolves." To him, a budget deficit wasn't an economic variable. It was a moral rot, a crack in the very foundation of civilization. It was as if I hadn't suggested a policy change, but rather a desecration of a sacred icon. This wasn't just German efficiency talking, it was something deeper, something almost biological, a violent rejection of anything that smelled like chaos. We're seeing this exact visceral reaction ripple across the entire German electorate right now. The sudden, seismic surge in polling for the CDU and CSU isn't just a routine political realignment. It is a massive collective immune response. After years of feeling the borders of their well-ordered manor blurring, the public isn't just looking for a new governing coalition, they are calling for the return of the Leviathan. They are attempting to re-ratify an ancient social contract, trading the unsafe freedom of the frontier for a controlled dignity within a defined perimeter. But why is the German psyche so uniquely terrified of the frontier mentality that the rest of the world seems to embrace? And is this desperate reach for Ordnung a sign of a civilization finding its strength, or a society desperately pruning its branches to save a trunk that can no longer weather the storm? That opening story, that conversation, I mean, it really just captures the sheer intensity of this moment in Germany, doesn't it?
It really does. It's so visceral.
Yeah. And so today, we're not here to talk about the usual, political horse trading. Our mission is to do a real deep dive into these underlying forces, the psychology, the philosophy that are driving this huge national shift.
Exactly. We're looking at what feels like a fundamental attempt by a society to sort of re-ratify its core social contract, because the world outside just feels increasingly chaotic.
It's fascinating.
It is, because we have to look past the spreadsheets, past the polling numbers, and ask, what are the deepest cultural tectonic plates that are shifting here?
And to really get our heads around that, we're going to look at it through three different lenses.
Right, three lenses. So first, we have to dig into the philosophical roots of German fiscal discipline. Why is the debt brake, this constitutional rule, seen as more than just budgeting? Why is it a moral contract?
A moral contract, I like that.
Then second, we'll contrast these two big ideas of a social contract. The European managed manner versus the American frontier mindset. It's a huge difference, and it explains so much. And finally, we'll look at the resurgence of what you could call the Hobbesian state, the Leviathan, and how it's showing up in mainstream German politics almost like a defense mechanism.
That story about my friend's reaction to the debt brake, the Schulden, it just leads us straight into that first lens, doesn't it? This idea of finance as a kind of moral theology.
It's the perfect entry point.
And it's not an isolated view. We saw almost the exact same sentiment in the story of Klaus, an elderly master carpenter from Baden-Württemberg.
Right, the carpenter.
For him, a national budget deficit isn't just some number on a page. It's a structural failure. He literally sees the state's budget the same way he sees a house he's been looking after for 60 years.
If you take on debt, you're putting a crack in the foundation.
Exactly, a crack in the foundation. And eventually, that crack leads to what he called civilizational entropy, just decay.
That is such a powerful analogy, and it really gets to the heart of the German view on public finance. It's this secular moral contract.
Secular moral contract.
Yeah. The whole point of the debt brake is to stop that decay, that entropy, from setting in. When you see borrowing as a moral failing, then a government that does it is seen as, well, it's betraying future generations, isn't it?
It's choosing the now over the forever.
Yes, precisely. It's a very deep-seated theology of survival, really, where being fiscally responsible is the ultimate defense against society just falling apart from the inside.
And what's so crucial here is that this isn't just, a feeling or a collection of anecdotes. It's baked right into the German language itself.
This is where it gets really specific and, frankly, measurable.
Yeah, that linguistic link between debt and guilt.
That's it. The German word for debt is Schulden, and it shares the same root, the same semantic space as the word for guilt, which is Schuld.
So they're basically the same word.
They're intertwined. And this is so much more than just a linguistic curiosity. This overlap, where debt automatically implies guilt, had these profound measurable effects on how an entire country thinks about borrowing.
So you mentioned the Schulden. For listeners who might not be familiar with it, can you just break down how this constitutional debt break actually works and why its structure reinforces this whole idea of debt as a moral problem?
Sure. So the Schulden is literally written into the German Constitution, their basic law. And what it does, essentially, is it prohibits the federal government from running what they call structural deficits.
So no deficit spending, basically.
Well, it's not a hard zero debt rule, but it is incredibly disciplined. The government is allowed to borrow a tiny, tiny amount, up to 35% of GDP, and that's to account for the normal ups and downs of the economy.
Okay.
But the main rule is that if you want to take on new debt, you have to invoke an emergency clause. And that is a huge political and constitutional hurdle.
So the whole system is designed to treat debt as a last resort.
Exactly. It treats debt as an exception, a sign that something is profoundly wrong, not as just another tool in the fiscal toolbox. The law itself institutionalizes that moral view that debt is dangerous and you have to avoid it at all costs.
And the data on this is wild. It really backs up the power of that cultural programming.
It really does.
We saw evidence that when you run surveys and you use that guilt-connoted word for debt, Schulden, support for government borrowing, it plummets.
It drops by about 5 percentage points.
Which is an 11% relative drop compared to asking the exact same question with a neutral word. That's a huge subconscious effect.
It is, and you see the pattern internationally, too. If you zoom out, researchers found that highly developed countries where the main language links debt and guilt, so Germany, Austria, the Netherlands, Scandinavia, they tend to have much lower public and household debt.
Compared to who?
Compared to countries with, say, Romance languages, where the words for debt and guilt are completely separate. It really suggests that the language you speak is fundamentally programming your collective financial risk tolerance.
And it's not just about the government or public opinion, is it? This thinking seeps down into corporate and even personal decisions.
Oh, absolutely. The guilt connotation affects what happens in the private sector. Studies have shown that this linguistic link makes German managers significantly less likely to plan on using debt to finance their firm's expansion.
Even if it would be the rational economic thing to do.
Even then, it just reinforces that idea from Klaus the Carpenter that you have a moral duty to repay your business debts as quickly as possible. Corporate finance becomes less about optimizing your return on capital and more about a moral quest to settle your Schuld.
Okay, so if the culture is driving the behavior, how do we know for sure that it's the language that's the cause and not just, something that happens to correlate with German efficiency or the historical memory of hyperinflation? I mean, proving causality here seems incredibly difficult.
It is incredibly tricky. And that's why this quasi-experiment that was done on the Swiss language border is so powerful. It's really convincing.
The Swiss border?
Yeah. So researchers used the border between the German-speaking parts of Switzerland and the Romance language parts, so French, Italian, Romansh, as a kind of natural laboratory. And the key is that they controlled for everything else. Income levels, age, how urban or rural an area was, and even canton-specific policies. By doing that, they could isolate communities that were basically identical except for the language they spoke.
So they could really pinpoint the effect of that linguistic frame.
Exactly.
And what did they find? What were the actual measurable differences right there on that border?
The differences were, they were stark. In terms of personal finance, the German-speaking towns right near the border had a 1.4 percentage point lower rate of people defaulting on their debts.
1.4%? That doesn't sound like a lot.
But in relative terms, that's a 23.7% difference. It's huge. It means that people whose language connects debt to guilt are just demonstrably more careful with their money and less likely to default, even when you account for their income and everything else.
Wow.
And you see the same thing in politics.
So that caution translated directly into support for a debt break.
Precisely. When it came to political views, the German-speaking areas had 5.1 percentage points less opposition to introducing a debt break compared to their Romance language neighbors.
Which is a 32% relative difference.
Right. It's just really compelling empirical proof that language isn't just descriptive. It's a foundational driver of deep political beliefs about fiscal discipline and order. It's not just policy, it's about identity.
Which means that savvy politicians, they're not really talking to the economy, are they? They're talking to the national psyche.
That's a great way to put it.
And we see this clear pattern of strategic rhetoric in the German parliament, the Bundestag, going back 30 years.
Oh, absolutely. This is a textbook case of politicians consciously tapping into that moral undertone in the language. The politicians known for being anti-debt, the ones pushing for austerity, they systematically use guilt-laden words like Schulden way more often than those who want more expansive policies.
They're making a moral case, not just an economic one.
Yes. Yeah. And the difference in intensity is just remarkable. The research showed that speeches arguing against public debt use this kind of language with over 50% more intensity than the speeches arguing for it.
So they are deliberately choosing their words to equate borrowing with some kind of societal or even spiritual failure.
It's a calculated move to trigger that deep cultural fear of civilizational entropy. You don't just hear them talk about interest rates, you hear them talking constantly about intergenerational responsibility.
Right, that classic line.
Yeah, the classic quote you always hear is something like, new debt means fueling inflation. We want our children and grandchildren to be able to make their own decisions.
And that completely reframes the whole debate.
It does. It's not about stimulus anymore. It's about defending the sovereignty of the next generation. Suddenly, sticking to the debt brake becomes a supreme moral duty. Budgeting becomes an act of defending the future itself.
And that foundation, this deep German cultural need for fiscal Ordnung that's rooted in linguistic guilt, it sets the stage so perfectly for our next section.
It really does.
Because this obsession with order in finance is really just one symptom of a much broader philosophical commitment to a very specific kind of social contract.
Exactly. We need to zoom out now from the theology of finance to the fundamental philosophies of how you organize a society. And that means looking at these competing social contracts that define these civilizations.
The European estate versus the American wilderness.
Precisely.
So just to set the context for everyone, the social contract, at its core, is this philosophical idea that people agree to give up some of their individual freedom in return for the benefits of an organized society, protection, order, all that stuff.
Right. And when we talk about different national identities, we're usually contrasting two major philosophical approaches.
The first being the Lockean or Rousseauian state.
Exactly.
Great.
Which is generally pretty minimalist. Its main job is to protect rights that you already have, and citizens are kind of taught to be suspicious of government power. Your freedom is freedom from the state.
And then on the other end of the spectrum,
you have the Hobbesian state, the Leviathan. This is a massive, all-powerful state that is seen as the only thing standing between us and what Thomas Hobbes called the war of all against all.
Which, for anyone who skipped philosophy class, is the Latin bellum omnium contra omnes, the state of nature where life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short.
Total chaos, exactly.
Yeah.
And the German model, or the broader Central European model, which was forged in centuries of chaos, leans very heavily into a highly ordered, a meticulously calibrated version of society.
And this brings us to that story about Elena, the municipal administrator. She sees society as a meticulously calibrated estate.
Yes.
Can you expand on that idea, the managed feudal estate model? Because it's so key to understanding the German aversion to spontaneity. Elena's description was fascinating. She said integrating newcomers wasn't like inviting them to a party. It was like onboarding a new gardener into an ancient, meticulously managed estate.
That phrasing is perfect. So in this model, the estate is ancient, which means the rules are older than anyone currently alive. And it's meticulously managed, which means every path, every border, every budget line already has a designated function.
Everything has its place.
Everything. And social peace depends entirely on everyone conforming to the pre-existing operating manual. The estate can only handle new people if they agree to submit to the existing system of Ordnung, of order. Spontaneity is seen as a huge risk because it could throw the whole ancient system into disarray.
And that fear, that explains so much about the anxiety we see over orderly immigration, doesn't it? The debate isn't just about culture, it's this deep fear that the complex social operating system is being overloaded.
Yes. If the system is seen as too fragile for total spontaneity, then the demand isn't just for fewer people, it's for orderly people, people who can plug into the predefined system right away.
And the kind of liberty you get in this system is very different.
Very different. It's what philosophers call positive liberty. Your freedom comes through the structures the state provides. You are free because you have access to high-quality social infrastructure, education, welfare, predictable career paths.
But the price of that freedom is conformity.
That's the trade. It is a controlled, dignified membership within a very clearly defined perimeter. And that whole system is enforced by the collective memory of what happens when that perimeter dissolves.
Which is the historical context here, right? The memory of total disaster, the ruins of post-World War II Germany. When you have to rebuild a society from absolute zero, you're going to build it with systems that prize rigidity and predictability above all else.
It creates a foundational choice in the national psyche. You choose controlled dignity over the unpredictable and frankly dangerous pursuit of freedom. Now, contrast that with the American model.
The unsafe frontier.
Exactly.
The philosophical bedrock of the U.S. is really Frederick Jackson Turner's frontier thesis from 1893. His big argument was that the whole process of pushing west, of conquering this rugged wilderness, is what fundamentally shaped the American character and made it so different from Europe.
Yes. Turner's point was that the American identity was forged by the need to win a wilderness. And that environment created democracy because your status was based on whether you could survive, not on who your parents were.
Right.
It bred individualism, egalitarianism, a deep suspicion of centralized power. But, and this is critical, he said, the frontier always has a potential for violence. You have to accept a higher level of social disorder, even danger, as the price you pay for unlimited opportunity.
As he said, American democracy came out of the American forest, and it gained new strength each time it touched a new frontier.
It's such a powerful image. The defining dynamic of the American model isn't fitting in. It's this expansive tower of the individual trying to get away from the state. The government is always a little bit suspect because the real engine of progress is the person fighting the wilderness, not the state managing the estate.
And that leads to the core American trade-off.
It does. A much higher societal tolerance for the unsafe but free. It's a fundamental belief in sifting for opportunity in the middle of chaos. The idea that the best things, the biggest breakthroughs, come from the unpredictable mess of the wilderness, rather than from trying to manage every single possibility of disorder.
I have to ask, though, doesn't that managed-to-state model just inevitably lead to stagnation? I mean, does the analysis get into that trade-off? Less chaos might also mean less disruptive innovation.
That's the central criticism that the two models have for each other. It's the core tension. The European model absolutely prioritizes stability and equality of access over disruptive innovation. The state is all about maintenance and slow, steady improvement to guarantee security for everyone inside. The American model, on the other hand, celebrates the disruption that comes from frontier chaos. It accepts that that instability will create spectacular booms, even if it also creates terrible busts that leave people behind. The difference really is your tolerance for failure and risk.
So in the German model, failure is a systemic crack, but on the American frontier, failure is just necessary friction for growth.
That's a perfect summary.
And what's really striking is how that frontier metaphor just keeps going in American thinking long after the actual physical frontier was closed.
So it never went away.
You saw it in politics with JFK's new frontier space, technology. These were the new wildernesses to conquer.
And you see it everywhere. Look at the physicists who founded Fermilab in Illinois. They were explicitly trying to recapture that frontier excitement. They built it on the prairie. They even kept a herd of bison on the grounds to symbolize their push into the frontier of physics.
And of course, cyberspace.
Of course, the whole idea of the electronic frontier, a new realm totally beyond the reach of physical governments where you could have radical freedom and self-determination.
So you end up with one civilization that's defined by the constant need to find new space and escape the state, and another that's defined by the desperate need to maintain perfect order within its fragile walls.
The contrast couldn't be sharper, and that brings us right up to the present day. What happens when that meticulously ordered European estate feels like it's being overwhelmed by global chaos?
The modern world, global instability, geopolitical shifts, migration, tech disruption, it's basically forcing frontier-level chaos right up to the gates of the German manor.
And the system is recoiling violently, both psychologically and politically.
That recoil is what we were calling that massive collective immune response. And we see it so clearly in the profile of Marcus, that middle-aged professional in Berlin who was suddenly drawn to the stern, assertive language of the center-right CDU.
His reasoning was almost biological.
It was. He wasn't interested in the fine print of policy proposals. He was just, as he put it, tired of the noise. Tired of the messy debates, the feeling of disorder on the streets, the instability of the world outside the manor. He just wanted the state to be the Leviathan again.
He's yearning for a Hobbesian restoration. He's not asking for radical new ideas. He's asking for radical stability. He wants the state to promise that it's still the ultimate shield against chaos.
And that collective feeling is what's driving the polling surge for the CDU-CSU as they roll out what we're calling the mainstream antibody strategy.
Let's define that, because it's not just a simple swing to the right. It's more like a biological function of a civilization trying to preserve itself.
Okay, so break that down. The mainstream antibody strategy.
So the center-right basically starts acting like the civilization's immune system. They identify the antigen, which is the public's anxiety over sovereignty, security, uncontrolled immigration, all the uncertainty from global instability.
Right.
And instead of dismissing that anxiety, which is what the far right loves, they absorb it. They metabolize those themes. They start demanding stricter security, better border control, a return to clear public order.
But they do it within the existing system.
That's the crucial part. They integrate these demands into the traditional framework of constitutional order and rational, effective government.
And in doing so, they create a synthesized antibody.
Exactly. And that antibody neutralizes the threat from the far-right populists who want to burn the whole system down, while at the same time preserving the integrity of the host organism, which is the German democratic state. It's a defense mechanism seeking stability through strength, reasserting the state's power and the rule of law.
But this isn't just about what's happening inside Germany's borders, is it? This psychological demand for a strong Leviathan at home translates directly into how Germany sees the world.
Oh, powerfully. The more insecure you feel at home, the more you want to control the environment outside. And that takes us right back to Germany's post-war history.
For decades after the war, Germany had to rely on its allies just to be accepted back into the world.
It was a precondition. They had to join NATO, they had to rebuild their military, not just for defense, but as Konrad Adenauer said, to regain any standing among the nations of the world. Their foreign policy was about getting external acceptance and security, not projecting their own power.
But that created a situation that analysts have always called an asymmetric equilibrium in Europe's security. What does that mean exactly? What was the asymmetry?
The asymmetry was both structural and psychological. The peace in Europe depended on the Soviets believing, without a doubt, that the U.S. will be willing to risk nuclear war to defend, say, Paris or Berlin.
Okay.
So Europe became completely dependent on American security guarantees. And that meant the biggest decisions about European security were often being made in Washington or Moscow, not in Europe itself. Europe had huge economic power, but in security terms, it was often the object of decision-making by non-European powers.
And this dependence was a constant source of anxiety, right? Fueling these calls, decade after decade, for Germany and Europe to take on a bigger, more independent role.
A constant source of friction. You heard it from German leaders, from Schmidt to Kohl to Merkel to Scholz.
And not just from them.
No. American officials, even back in the 80s, were pointing out that Europe was no longer shattered, impoverished, and disunited.
Yeah.
By then, Europe's economy was bigger than the U.S. economy, but the security bill was still disproportionately on the American taxpayer. The calls for more burden sharing have been a constant drumbeat.
And the urgency of that whole conversation just exploded as the global order started to fray, especially after 2020.
Right.
The modern anxiety, as Frank-Walter Steinmeier put it, was this sudden realization that the global Pax Americana, that predictable American-led order, was at risk of crumbling right in front of them.
And that was a genuine shock to the German psyche, which had built its entire managed manner inside the safe walls of that American guaranteed perimeter. The crumbling of that framework meant the end of a long-held German hope.
Steinmeier basically delivered the bad news.
He did. He said the hope that others will somehow sort it out for us is a vain one, for us Germans at least. Germany realized it had hit a point of no return. It couldn't just be a beneficiary of security anymore. It had to become a guarantor of its own order.
And that all culminated in this massive political shift known as the Zeitenwende. We have to connect the dots here between the internal demand for the Leviathan and this huge external shift.
The Zeitenwende, the turning point that Chancellor Scholz announced, was a radical break with decades of German foreign policy. And it aligns perfectly with the public's internal demand for a strong, assertive state.
And the most concrete example of that
was the immediate commitment of a $100 billion special fund to modernize the German military, the Bundeswehr. That move shows that the internal desire for Hobbesian stability now has to be translated into a foreign policy that can find its own answers to a changing world.
It's the ultimate expression of the managed state deciding it has to secure its own perimeter instead of just relying on outside guards.
Yes, and this new mandate requires realism. It requires adaptation.
It's a demand for, what was the phrase, a credible desire, actually, to help Europe to assert its interests.
Exactly. It means moving past the old pacifism and reliance on economic soft power. It means building a European foreign and security policy that is designed for effective, independent action. The psychological need for Ordnung at home now demands the projection of power abroad to make sure that order isn't shattered by a chaotic external world.
So if we pull all of this together, the moral theology of debt, the commitment to the managed estate, the call for the Hobbesian Leviathan, what we're left with are two fundamentally different survival aesthetics operating in the West today.
On the one hand, you have the American tradition. It's still expansive, still driven by that frontier aesthetic.
Correct.
It chooses to sift for opportunity amidst chaos. It tolerates instability because the bet is that freedom and risk will lead to greater rewards.
And then you have Germany, deeply, maybe irrevocably shaped by the memory of ruins and the cultural weight of guilt and debt. And it chooses the opposite path.
It chooses to safeguard its provisions within the confines of a well-ordered, if sometimes stifling, sanctum. It's a conscious historical choice for controlled dignity over unsafe freedom.
The political trajectory we're seeing in Germany right now feels like a quiet but really powerful verdict on that optimistic story of linear progress. That idea that the world was just inevitably becoming more borderless and liberal.
That assumption is being questioned. Instead, the collective pendulum is swinging back towards something older, something more primal.
The worship of discipline?
The worship of boundaries, and a belief in the necessity of the containing vessel. It is the distinct survival aesthetic of a society that is turning inward, pruning its own branches, accepting certain limits, all in an effort to preserve the core, the trunk, against the forces of entropy and the chaos of the outside world.